Okay, so let's speak a little bit about thyroid hormone and its function. Now we know it's lipophilic simply because it moves right into the bloodstream, which we saw, and it acts like a steroid hormone, which is also a lipophilic molecule, right? Fatty in its makeup, and so it goes right through the phospholipid bilayer very easily. Now, thyroid hormone is going to alter rates of transcription of mRNA, and what that means is it's going to change our rate of metabolism. It's going to make our cells use more energy, and we'll talk about the specific ways it does that. But it does that by altering rates of transcription of DNA. So it goes into the nucleus and changes the way mRNA is made to make proteins. Okay, we should know that central dogma, that order of making proteins from DNA. Okay, cretinism is an interesting disease that is seen in infants that lack thyroid hormone. And interestingly, adults that have a hormone deficiency of thyroid hormone usually don't get this, or usually don't have much of an impactful disease. We usually just supplement those individuals with thyroid hormone. But with infants that lack thyroid hormone during development, they end up with this disease, this cretinism. And this can impact their cognition and their entire life. This is irreversible. And it really speaks to the importance of thyroid hormone during the developmental period, okay? All right, let's talk about the calorigenic effects of thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone increases the rate of the sodium-potassium pump, okay, which speeds up our cellular activity. It's going to increase the number and size of our mitochondria. We should already connect that to energy needs, right? If we're making more mitochondria, we're increasing the size of our mitochondria. That means we're making more energy. We're making more ATP. There are more metabolic demands on the cell. It increases oxidative phosphorylation enzymes, which also goes hand in hand with increasing mitochondria, right? That area where oxidative phosphorylation takes place. It enhances glycogenolysis, so breaking down of glycogen to free glucose so that we can use it to make energy. Proteolysis, breaking down of proteins, again, to free energy. And lipolysis, breaking down of fats to make ketones and fatty acids. Again, freeing up energy, freeing up sources of making ATP. It promotes gluconeogenesis, which is helping to push more blood glucose into our bloodstreams to be liberated in other cells, again, in an effort to free energy to make ATP. And then ketone synthesis is another breakdown product that we can use to make ATP. And then it promotes the synthesis of beta-adrenergic receptors. Where do we see beta-adrenergic receptors? Where do we see beta-adrenergic receptors? And if anyone says, I've never seen or never heard of beta receptors, I'm going to cry. Where do we see beta-adrenergic receptors? In the sympathetic system, right? In the sympathetic system. So if we insert more of these receptors onto our membranes, what type of change, what type of response will we see in our body? We'll see more of that sympathetic response, right? Inserting more of these beta-adrenergic receptors goes hand in hand with an increased fight or flight response. And just to talk a little bit about the correlation of thyroid hormone, that's such a hard word for me to say. Thyroid hormone, we basically see that cells are ramping up their energy production. And this is why patients with hyperthyroidism, where they have excess of this, they lose weight very quickly. They're usually anxious, they sweat a lot. They usually have loss of hair, thinning of hair, just those signs of overexertion or over metabolism, basically. And so this is what we typically see. This is why we typically see those symptoms, because the cells are in this anabolic state continuously. Okay, any questions on the thyroid hormone bit? Let's speak a little bit more about the regulation of calcium, if there aren't any questions. Any questions? Okay, so let's talk about parathyroid hormone. Now, parathyroid hormone is released from the parathyroid glands, and these are not in the thyroid, so to speak, but they are embedded in the posterior aspect of the thyroid. So this is a posterior view, and we can see the 4 parathyroid glands sort of pouched in the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. Parathyroid hormone regulates calcium levels in the blood. So whereas we saw calcitonin that brings calcium levels down, parathyroid hormone brings calcium levels up, okay? And it does so by pulling calcium from our bones, okay? So it mineralizes or demineralizes bone to bring out that calcium. And so that regulation between calcitonin and parathyroid hormone is what keeps our calcium levels in check, in balance. Okay, any questions about the thyroid gland, about the parathyroid glands, about thyroid hormone? Okay, let's move on to speak about glucocorticoids on our metabolism, and then let's compare glucocorticoids in terms of their different effects, their different pharmacological effects. All right, so we'll move on to speak about another endocrine gland. This is the adrenal gland. We've talked about the adrenal gland before. We talked about it as it pertains to the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system. Now we know that the adrenal gland has 2 parts to it. Okay, let's back up a little bit. The adrenal glands are above the kidneys, okay? They're bilateral, so above both kidneys, and they have 2 layers to them. There's a medulla, which is this darker staining region inside. What type of cells did we see in the medulla? What type of cells did we see in the medulla? Chromaffin cells, perfect, chromaffin cells. And these chromaffin cells were a part of the autonomic, specifically the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. The cortex of the medulla, which is this outer, lighter, paler staining region, is where we have the release of our steroid hormones. So this class of hormones that we call adrenocorticoids, also called steroid hormones, includes 3 types of hormones that are released from this cortical layer, this cortex layer. The first one is mineralocorticoids or aldosterone. This is important in our water balance, right? Similar to ADH, which we saw. This will determine how much sodium and potassium, basically the saltiness of our plasma, and it will regulate whether or not we need to reabsorb sodium or we can waste it in the urine, okay? When we get to the kidneys, we'll talk about how mineralocorticoids act. Glucocorticoids, which are cortisol, this regulates the body's response to stress, and this is commonly called the stress hormone. It's going to regulate our metabolism, but it's going to help us deal with stressful physiologic situations. Okay, and I'll talk about those. And lastly, sex hormones or androgens. These are important in the reproductive function. Okay, we'll talk about those in the reproductive system. So here, you don't need to know too much about the details of the hormones, but just know what the 3 hormones are, where they're released in the adrenal gland. Okay, we talked about the medulla before, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but we know that it's a part of our secretory, our sympathetic nervous system, specifically the chromaffin cells, and so it's going to be under neural control. What type of neuron is controlling the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla? What type of neuron? What type of neuron? What neuron synapses onto the adrenal medulla, the chromaffin cell? What do we call that neuron? Is it postganglionic? Is it preganglionic? Is it a motor neuron? So it's going to be a preganglionic sympathetic neuron. Okay, a preganglionic sympathetic neuron coming from T1 to L2, travels out to the adrenal chromaffin cell, synapses onto that chromaffin cell, and we know the chromaffin cell acts just like a postganglionic neuron. Okay, guys, don't forget that. Don't forget that stuff we talked about. Okay, let's speak a little bit about the functions of glucocorticoids. So cortisol mainly is our stress hormone. It's regulated through this axis, very similar to the axis we just drew out. With regard to the thyroid gland, is this adrenal axis. Now, we're not going to draw out that schematic, but I encourage you over the weekend to draw out a similar schematic diagram or a similar axis of CRH to ACTH to the adrenal cortex, okay? Cortisol helps to mobilize energy stores. It helps to suppress our immune response. This is why we give it to surgical patients or patients who are sick or ill or have cancer. It helps to tone down our inflammatory response, our immune response. It also helps us with memory formation, interestingly. And this kind of ties into that sympathetic involvement. If we're fighting or fleeing from a threatening environment or from a threatening source, we kind of want to remember that evolutionarily. We want to remember that. We want to remember it for future references to avoid those types of environments or events, okay? So cortisol does a whole bunch of things, but most importantly, it is our stress hormone. It helps our body manage stress. Now, when I say stress, I don't mean like stressing about a test or like stress. I mean physiologic stress. So surgery, bleeding, a cancer or a tumor, those types of stressful events that happen in our body. Okay, so the role of cortisol in the stress response is to increase cortisol secretion for one, which helps to increase the sympathetic response or the sympathetic activity. Again, cortisol kind of goes hand in hand with fighting, flighting, or freezing, okay? If something threatening or stressful is happening to your body, even if it's surgery, your body thinks that this is a time to fight or flee or freeze, okay? And so that's a very common response that we see with cortisol. Which also goes hand in hand with epinephrine secretion. We know that epinephrine brings about sympathetic response, okay? It also increases ADH release. This helps us to reabsorb water in the kidneys. We talked about ADH or vasopressin that's released from the posterior pituitary, and it's going to bring more water back into the body, antidiuretic or antidiuresis. And that will also help in threatening or stressful situations. It increases angiotensin II, which plays into this reabsorption of water. And then it increases our fight or flight response, okay? This allows us to mobilize energy and to maintain our blood pressure, okay? So this is some of the reason that we use cortisol, and this is what it does. It helps us to respond to a stressful environment. All right, any questions on cortisol? Any questions on the adrenal gland? Again, I encourage you to draw out that axis that we did for the thyroid gland and to point out those two types of feedback loops, okay, as homework over the weekend. Let's move on to describe hormonal regulation in our absorptive state, which I'll call the fed state, and then our non-absorptive or post-absorptive state, which I'll call the fasted state. So this is really talking about how our body differs in the feeding versus the fasting cycle, feeding and fasting, okay? All right, so we know there are two states in the body. One is when we're storing energy to make macromolecules or sort of putting things away for later. And as we talk about this, it's kind of difficult to talk about this in our society today, just because we don't have periods where we go for a while without food, and just because food is so easily accessible in our society. But this really applies to, if you think about caveman days, where food was really hard to get, a very scarce resource, and so we had to eat to preserve nutrients for another day or so until we could find food again. And that's what the feeding and fasting cycle really, really ties into. So we're feeding, we are putting away energy into macromolecules. We're making those macromolecules to store energy away. That's like making fat. And then the post-absorptive state or fasting is when we are using or mobilizing that energy. We're breaking down those molecules that we made to sort of free up that ATP so that we can do work, do cellular work, do physical work, okay? All right, so in the absorptive state or in the fed state, the energy input is greater than the energy output. Nutrients are being absorbed. Here we're seeing glucose as our primary source for energy. So excess nutrients, let's say you're having a big, huge meal. Again, thinking about you're a caveman and maybe you found some interesting food, whatever that is, and you have a large meal, and so you intake an excess of nutrients that are eventually being stored away for when you can't find food, okay? We store away glucose into the liver and in the muscle as glycogen, and we store away triglycerides into our adipose tissue, which is our fat tissue, okay? So this is how we put energy away for times when food is scarce, okay? Which is really hard to say in our society, in the construct of our society. Okay, let's talk about what's actually happening here. So glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids are our main biomolecules. These come in through our diet, whatever type of food we've eaten, and we can put those away for later in these forms, okay? So we can store away glucose, we can use it in our cells, right? We use whatever we need in the moment, and then we can put some away in the form of glycogen into our liver and our muscle, okay? We can also store away glycerol and fatty acids in the liver and adipose tissue, and those will make triglycerides. So that's how we store away our fat. We make triglycerides and put them into our adipose cells or our liver. And likewise, we can store away amino acids in the liver. We can convert them to fatty acids and then store them in the liver, or we can make proteins. So amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and to sort of put those away for later, we can build them up into a few proteins and store them, okay? Now, this is not usually a source for breaking down energy, and I'll talk about that when we get to there, but just understand that glucose is usually our main source of energy. Okay, so that was the fed state or the absorptive state. Let's talk about the fasted state. So during the post-absorptive state, the energy output is going to be greater than the energy input, meaning that we're using more energy than we're bringing in. This is, again, where food is scarce. You've gone a while without a meal or without any source of food, and so now it's time to sort of tap into these reserves that we've put away previously. So glucose is spared for the nervous tissue, and the brain is really spoiled, kind of like the spoiled brat up there in this way. It only uses or only likes glucose. And so even in starvation mode, even in lack or in scarcity, the brain still demands glucose, which is sometimes hard to get. Okay, so we can use other fatty acids, other tissues can use fatty acids as a source of energy, but the brain really likes glucose, okay? The brain really needs glucose. And so although it can use some fatty acids, it really prefers to use glucose. This is why we get that brain fog if you haven't had a starchy meal. I know there's this trending, the ketogenic diet, which is where you sort of limit your carbs and your starchy foods. And so you run your body purely on fat breakdown. So breaking down triglycerides, breaking down fatty acids. And this is where the brain kind of suffers, okay? Because it really likes glucose. So stored nutrients are broken down and mobilized here, which is what I pretty much said before. All right, let's talk about exactly what's happening. So again, we're breaking down molecules from muscles, from our adipose tissue, and from our liver, mainly. We can break down proteins, but again, this is very rare. This is in extreme starvation mode, do we start to break down protein. This is like our last source of energy. We can break down fats, right? We can break those triglycerides into their fatty acids and glycerol components. Those can be used to mobilize some energy here. Or they can be taken to the liver, converted to ketones, and ketones can also be used as an energy source. The brain can use a little bit of ketones, which is kind of nice. They can go right through the blood-brain barrier because they're fatty in their makeup, and so they can slip right into the brain. And so this is kind of what saves the brain on these ketogenic diets, that small amount of ketones that's in your blood that can go right across the blood-brain barrier and pretty much give your brain some energy in the absence of glucose. But our main source of energy should be glucose and is glucose, right? It comes from the liver or from our muscles where it's being stored as glycogen. It can be broken down into glucose. There are two ways to break it down. If we have oxygen, that goes to pyruvate, right? This goes way back to that first unit, that first exam, right? We can break this down to pyruvate and then send it off to the ETC. Or if there's no oxygen, we can make lactate. And that's kind of why we get that burn in our muscles when we're working out for a long time, right? That lactate. So that makes glucose, and then glucose is, we